This video is going to be about Helen Burns and Mr. Brocklehurst from Jane Eyre. Okay, so Helen Burns. Helen Burns was based on Maria Bronte, which was Charlotte Bronte's eldest sister, who died of tuberculosis in the Clergy Daughters School, which is basically the school that was represented through the school that Jane goes to in the book Jane Eyre. One could argue that Helen Burns was religious fervour, as she is seen within the book as one of the more religious characters that impacts Jane on her religious worldviews and her beliefs in God. Okay, one quote from Helen. "I live in the calm, looking to the end." Helen readily and passively accepts suffering. She believes that suffering leads to salvation, which, from a certain point of view, is a quite saddening perspective on life. From a certain perspective, one could argue that Charlotte Bronte portrays Helen in such a way just to show how the evangelical Christian perspectives that that people pursued within the Victorian era were damaging to the well-being of children. Helen has a very different philosophy of life to Jane. Helen believes in the spiritual, however, Jane is more in the moment. She wants to express her emotions. She doesn't want to forgive Mrs. Reed for all the abuse that has occurred to her. And because of this, Helen sort of teaches Jane of forgiveness, of salvation, and this image of forgiveness and of emotional control resonates with Jane throughout the entire book, from Helen and onwards. From one perspective, Helen seems very remote compared to Jane's passions. I mean, she's very based on the spiritual, and this contrast juxtaposes with Jane's own worldly perspectives, and this further emphasizes the two contrasting worldviews. One thing that Helen really impacts Jane with is that Helen has the ability to stay calm in times of hardship, i.e., she's currently in an extremely poor scenario. She has nobody that she loves surrounding her. She's often hated on by the teachers. However, she continuously remains calm, and through this, Helen teaches Jane of emotional control, which Jane continues to repeat within her mind throughout the rest of her journeys as she struggles to control her emotions. Another quote, "Strange light, ray, unstuffed candle burnt dimly." Helen exudes light. She seems heavenly. She lives for the spiritual, and through this one can see Helen as an icon for Jane, as something that Jane looks up to in order to be a better version of herself. Helen also helps Jane choose a stoic path. When she's up on the pedestal of infamy, Helen helps Jane control her emotions and not lash out in anger, but just stand there and accept that in order to succeed in society, Jane needs to play alongside with the rules. Helen's look bestows strength to Jane to help her master her feelings and help her maintain her dignity. The fact that upon the scenes close to Helen's death, there's the image of an unsnuffed candle that burnt dimly, suggests that Helen's faith will carry on affecting Jane. Just like candles can be reignited, Helen's death is not the end of her light. Her light will be reignited throughout Jane's life, in Jane's memories of her. And lastly, one could argue that the image of a candle acts as a tragic symbol of mortality and the inevitability of death. Candles eventually will be blown out. Eventually, they will all be used up. And this sort of represents how Helen's life is just has so easily been blown out, and it's a tragic reminder to Jane that that her life is also fragile, and in order to achieve freedom, she needs to make sure that she makes the most of her time. Another quote of Helen: "By dying young, I shall accept great sufferings." It's quite saddening to hear this quote as well, because Helen has nothing in life, so she looks towards the afterlife. Otherwise, she would face a life of suffering if she didn't die young. And only God has ever offered Helen unconditional love. Jane also says, "I clasp my arms closer around" in her account of her last night with Helen. And this acts as a tragic, desperate motion and a reminder of the fragility of life. Jane has always been quite a physical being, and she finds comfort in the physical, as a contrast to Helen, who finds comfort in the spiritual, in God. However, the fact that she clasped her arms closer around highlights just how resonant her friendship with Helen is, and how much she tries to grapple on to Helen's life, because it's the only form of friendship, the only form of love that she's experienced so far, bringing the scene to be ever more tragic. However, later, the fact that on Helen's grave there's the word Resurgam indicates that Helen's influence will rise again. She will continue to affect Jane. And the impact of Helen throughout Jane's life is further intensified through the fact that Jane revisits Helen's grave. Helen no longer has a pauper's grave because of Jane, and this shows how Jane honored Helen's grave because of the importance that Helen had on Jane's life. Okay, so Mr. Brocklehurst. Mr. Brocklehurst is a representation, as most literary critics have argued, of this guy called William Carus Wilson, who was the founder of the Clergy Daughters' School, which Jane and her sisters went to, and is also where Jane's sister, Maria Bronte, died of tuberculosis. Jane often recounted that there are often recounts of this place as being quite abusive, quite negative, not exactly a place that Jane would have ideally wanted to go to. Mr. Brocklehurst is described as a black pillar and having a face like a carved mask. He is described as a black pillar, and this architectural metaphor, i.e., of the pillar, emphasizes how Mr. Brocklehurst is seen as callous. He's a repression of humanity. He doesn't show his emotions. He's just this pillar, really. And this emphasizes how he intensifies Jane's insignificance in society. And this also portrays Jane as sort of helpless, overcome by the oppressive nature of patriarchy that that sort of imprisons her behind these black pillars. Also, some people, my English teacher actually said that the black pillar, there's also this quote that says he stood erect, which can be a symbol of, masculine identity, i.e., the erect. I'm not going to elaborate more into that, but you can have a look at it in your own time. Face like a carved mask. This simile makes Mr. Brocklehurst's face appear militaristic, angular, and rigid. He doesn't seem human, he seems emotionless. He also seems the immovable object to Jane's unstoppable force. He physically is in front of Jane, stopping her from running away to freedom. He also metaphorically is imprisoning Jane in this school, restricting Jane from showing her emotions and from developing how she wants to express herself as a being. He's also a symbol of masculinity and the Victorian superego, which is which was coined by Gilbert and Gubar. This saying, the Victorian superego is basically a word that describes the potent, oppressive, toxic masculinity during the Victorian era that Jane obviously so clearly has to suffer under. Another description of Mr. Brocklehurst: what a mouth and what large prominent teeth. Through the description of the large prominent teeth and the mouth, Mr. Brocklehurst seems quite predatory. He feeds on Jane's terror. This portrays children as victims to religion, which is quite shocking, as religion was often seen as the sort of force that people looked up to that controlled people's lives, and the fact that Mr. Brocklehurst, this important religious figure, appears so dangerous, suggests that Bronte may even be sort of rebelling against religion in some sort of way. This also acts as a clear allusion to Little Red Riding Hood. Mr. Brocklehurst is seen as an archetypal villain, which basically means a stereotypical villain in storybooks. Jane Eyre, therefore, is also seen as a nest of illusions, which Gilbert and Gubar coined the term of. Further in the book, you can see other allusions to stories. For example, I think there's an allusion to Gulliver's Travels somewhere. We'll spot them along the way. Another quote: "Do you know where the wicked go after death?" This reflects the evangelical Christian belief in the innate sinfulness of children that was often pursued in the Victorian era. Basically, children were seen as inherently sinful, and in order to rid children of this sinfulness, people believed that you had to basically abuse and oppress children to cause them to realize their faithfulness in God. However, the fact that Mr. Brocklehurst is seen as, I said before, predatory and sort of wicked, suggests that Jane, the proxy for Bronte, supports a more romantic view. The central tenet of the Romantic movement is that what is inherent and original in humankind is natural. The Romantics regarded children as innocent and pure until corrupted by society. And this suggests that Bronte wants to rebel against these evangelical Christian beliefs and support a more nurturing view of how children should be brought up. One could argue that through this portrayal of Mr. Brocklehurst, Bronte mocks patriarchal cruel society disguised as religiosity, as Mr. Brocklehurst presents himself as religious and pious, but clearly in fact uses religion to abuse and instill fear. Mr. Brocklehurst also says, but we are not to conform to nature. This is when he's talking about the hair of that girl who tells her to cut it off, and then his own daughters come in these opulent French curls and really expensive, elaborate dressing. So this brings in a bit of context, which was the politics of hair. Hair was often seen as a symbol of vanity, and therefore needed to be covered up. From a certain perspective, this implies that this covering up of hair acts as a symbol of the oppression of female values and of female freedom that was needed in order to conform to these patriarchal, evangelical Christian values. And therefore, this implies how Mr. Brocklehurst highly represses the children within his school, crushes their individuality. The fact that his daughters later come in these, French curls and fancy dress, presents Mr. Brocklehurst as a satirical image of hypocrisy through the opulent, decadent furnishings of his daughter. Therefore, Mr. Brocklehurst acts as a caricature of hypocrisy, basically a very hypocritical person. Thanks for watching. As you can see, there's Mr. Brocklehurst on the left and Helen Burns on the right. There'll be more videos coming up soon. Hope you enjoyed.